2023 has been one of those years that, by the end of it, you feel like it's been simultaneously 2 weeks and 2 decades. I mean, every year has been like that to a degree since you know what happened, but I think this one in particular has made time feel especially nebulous. I think back to the things I was doing and the shows I went to in March, and it feels like an entirely different lifetime, and yet I think about writing last year's list, and it feels like just a couple months ago. A big part of that, I think, was the fact that for music, 2023 was pretty lopsided. Until about June, I was pretty much ready to write the whole thing off for releases. There were a couple of great ones, but in general, the quantity just wasn't there, especially compared to 2022. And when I had less than half a list's worth of contenders by June, I was definitely starting to worry. And then, something happened. Albums started coming out. Great ones. More and more and more and more until suddenly I had the exact opposite issue when there was just too much to keep up with, bringing me to where I am now with so many albums, I can't even fit them all in a list of the top 50. I had so many I had to cut to make room, in fact, that I've recorded a semi-scripted companion video where I talk about a handful of the albums that couldn't quite make the cut for me, but still gave me something to talk about. For just $3, you can get access to that, my private Discord server, and anything else I decide to throw in as a bonus. As with last year, I want to shout out a couple of albums that would have probably made my list if I'd heard them in time, starting with a band I've become obsessed with in 2023, that being Snow Strippers with their self-titled album and especially April Mixtape 2. That one has been on constant repeat since I heard it a few months ago, and it would very likely have cracked my top 5. This was also the year I took the Giz pill, and King Gizzard dropped a bunch of albums last year. Only one made my list back then, but ever since, Omnium Gatherum has grown on me a bunch, and I realized I'd been sleeping hard on changes. Finally, I want to shout out Adeem the Artist, who released White Trash Revelry, which has become one of my favorite country albums of the decade so far. The very distinct intersectionality between queer NB and grassroots upbringing calls to mind classics like Lavender Country, but with a modern twist. With all this groundwork out of the way, I want to introduce you to my list of the top 50 records I heard this year. More so this year than any, the ranking is pretty unimportant, and I had such a variety of genres that ranking it felt like a no-win situation, especially as we get to the top of the list. Without further ado, let's get started. At number 50, I have an artist who made my list last year and who you can expect to hear from again soon, and that's Jane Remover moniker Leroy. After completing her genre-defining Daria Core trilogy, it was time to move on and kill the Leroy alias, but not before dropping her last hurrah, this unbelievable monolith of mashup and hyperflip. Perhaps a bit headache-inducing, and certainly not for the uninitiated, but in terms of high-energy electronic music from 2023, you're not going to hear anything like this. Going in the opposite direction for a moment, number 49 for me is the future classic soft rock record from the Lemon Twigs, Everything Harmony. Honoring the classics like Beach Boys and Fleetwood Mac, this record contains some of the most beautiful harmonies, sweetest vocals, and most lush instrumentals I've heard all year. Original? Not particularly, but when it's hitting this level of quality, matching even that of its forefathers, it's hard to complain. Next, at 48, is Snow Strippers, who I just mentioned a minute ago, and while they did release the excellent April Mixtape 3 earlier in the year, it's the much more recent Night Killers EP that really did it for me. Every Snow Strippers song is kind of the same, which is perfect for someone like me who loves them, but I do think this set of tracks sees them going in a noisier, bassier direction than usual, and in a lot of ways, stripping back the Crystal Castle's influence and solidifying their unique sound. At 47, do you like high-energy, lo-fi indie rock? You'll probably like Geburger by Jezebel Geburgleby then. Straightforward, fun, low-stakes bangers from front to back, and I can't think of many records that make me want to have more of a reckless good time than this one. Of all the artists to come out of this Gen Z power pop craze, Jezebel is by far the one I'm most excited to hear more from. For 46, how about some of the least fun you'll have listening to music this year? Jutgeist stands as one of the most unique voices in underground experimental black metal right now, and with this most recent album, it's easy to see why. Moving across the listener in waves and cycles, looping in on itself and slithering like an Ouroboros, there are times where this microtonal barrage feels downright sickening to listen to, but it's almost certainly the most unique metal album you will hear this year. At 45 is one of my most anticipated comebacks in quite some time, that being the return of death metal monsters Horrendous with Ontological Mysterium. I've loved Idol for a very long time, so hearing that the band were going prog on this album was initially a little disappointing, but trust me when I say that they more than deliver. This isn't your typical brutal gone cheesy story like we saw a little bit with Tomb Mold. Instead, we've got vicious performance after vicious performance given just that little bit of extra juice by more melody and technicality. Speaking of awaited returns, at 44 I've got Squid's new sophomore record, O Monolith, which, despite only coming 2 years after the debut, feels like it's been forever in the deluge of great windmill scene acts we've heard from since. On this record, though, Squid show off all the reasons they were so special back then, and why they deserve to grow even more relevant. Massive art punk arrangements are given the invigorating performances they deserve, and the band flexes their musical range on this record even more than the last, with groove, atmosphere, and cacophony all sharing equal space and care throughout. Making her second appearance at number 43 is Jane Remover, this time under her main alias with her new album Census Designated. There's been something of a trend this year of formerly hyperpop adjacent artists picking up the guitar for their new albums, and this is one of the most obvious examples, diving right into shoegaze and post-rock for her most emotionally vulnerable release yet. This goes well beyond revivalism and becomes one of the more powerful steps forward the genre has seen in a while. Jumping back to the windmill scene real quick for 42, Maruha released their debut EP this year titled Knocknaria, and while it took a while to grow on me, I think it's pretty undeniable that this band is shaping up to be one of the coolest voices out of this scene. Gorgeous and gripping post-rock arrangements, unbelievable sax playing, and just the most expressive vocals this side of Isaac Wood. There's very few albums I'm looking forward to as much as this debut. At 41, I've got what I could argue as the most eclectic black metal release of the year, and that's the one-woman project Victory Over the Sun with her newest album titled Dance You Monster to My Soft Song. How this is conceived of by a single mind is beyond me, with such lush and creative composition on every piece, be it the melodicism on track 1, the sheer brutal heaviness on the second, or the sunshine pop influence later on. There's nothing quite like this out there, and if you're something of a black metal skeptic, I think this would be a good place to start, if only because it's so fascinating. What was I saying earlier about hyperpop artists picking up the guitar? At number 40, I've got my next example of this hyper rock phenomenon with Underscore's new record, Wall Socket. Underscore has never really played it straight with hyperpop conventions, but here we see them going full concept album, diving headfirst into the soul-crushing Midwestern small-town experience. Everyone knows everyone, and everyone knows just a little more than they're supposed to. The variety of instrumental palettes on here is pretty staggering, and the vocals have improved dramatically since last time, which gives this the extra layer to make it grow. I mentioned earlier that I took the Giz pill in 2023, and at 39 is my evidence for that with their new metal album, Petrodragonic Apocalypse. Their previous metal album always kind of evaded me as pretty hit or miss, so I was a little hesitant about a return to that style, but luckily for me, this is an improvement and evolution on that formula in just about every way it could have been. Songs are more developed, more technical, and better paced, and the performances are gripping from front to back. Where Rat's Nest felt to me like a good experiment for the band, Petro feels like an honest-to-God, fantastic metal album, and I'm completely sold on them doing more albums in this style. For number 38, I've got what is most certainly the funkiest album of the year, that being Ana Frango Elétrico's newest album, with a title I'm not even going to attempt to read aloud. Not a second spent listening to this thing is spent doing anything but grooving with a cheek-to-cheek smile across your face, and Anna's beautiful melodies and sharp pop songwriting gives this a re-listenability that keeps me coming back to this over and over. It's the perfect blend of funk, MPB, city pop, and 80s rock that I didn't know I was missing until I had it. It's long been a trend in Carly Rae Jepsen's discography that the B-sides are just as good as, or better than, the main album, and with Loveliest Time at 37, that's never been more the case. I liked Loneliest Time fine, some clear bangers on there, but also a few duds. On this year's follow-up, however, no such inconsistency is found. It's bop after bop with very little wiggle room in terms of quality. Combine that with possibly the biggest stylistic leap of her career thus far, with much more diverse and grounded live instrumentation and some of her strongest vocal performances, and it's hard not to see this as one of the best records she's ever put out. For 36, I've got an album that I think everyone is expecting to see here, and that's the new Jeff Rosenstock record, Hell Mode. This is not my favorite record he's ever put out, but considering he's literally my favorite living artist, that still ranks it as one of the best albums this year for me. On this album, it feels like Jeff is simultaneously getting more accessible and breaking his regular formula in some really interesting ways, be it blast beats, 7-minute songs, or even just the inclusion of way more ballads. All of it works, and none of it sacrifices any of what makes him such a personable and lovable artist. It's just as vulnerable as ever, and while it is still taking its time to grow on me, I absolutely love it as is. In contrast to the obvious pick from me, 35 is an album that nobody expected because statistically none of you know who this is, and that's Excoriating Dawn by Teeth Dreams. I was put onto this album by another Australian noise master, Uboa, who did the cover art, and it's this really gorgeous and horrifying dark ambient, death industrial, musique concrète piece that creates an atmosphere so desolate that it's hard not to get sucked into its pit of anguish. This thing contains some of the most enthralling soundscapes, beautiful use of sampled instruments and sounds, and some of the most gut-churning noise performances I've ever heard. Be wary if you're not well or at all versed in noise music, but if you are, then there isn't a better album in the genre this year, to my knowledge. Remaining on the inaccessible side of music for a little bit, though perhaps slightly less so, I've got one of Tra's new albums at 34. I say one of because Damien seemingly cannot stop dropping new music. This year alone, they have released 17 albums under the Tra name, and dozens more under other aliases. This one, though, with a title I can't even begin to fathom the pronunciation of, is my favorite. The atmosphere that this project is so well known for crafting is at peak form here, and across its two very long tracks, it manages to feel infinitely expansive without feeling bloated or unwarranted at any point. The ranges of influence include stuff like post-metal and black ambient as usual, but more interesting to me is the way that at times this thing gets out of metal entirely and plays with comfier synth tones and even like drum and bass rhythms. In a year with no shortage of amazing out-there black metal, this one stood out to me as one of the most invigorating. But if you like your metal a little more brutal, at 33 I've got just about the most brutal death metal I have ever heard, and that's Nithing with their debut album Agonal Hymns. This is brutal to an almost comedic degree. It's like you threw None So Vile in a blender and played the resulting slop at 4 times speed. What's more insane is that this is all written and performed by one man, Matt Kilner, and you can actually see a video of him performing all of these songs on drums live, not sped up. It's very goofy, undeniably, but despite the airtight aggression from front to back and the sheer speed of everything, it's got riffs and the guitar melodies to keep it from dragging for even a second. I doubt you'll find a less accessible album this year, at least one that manages to also match this level of quality. Going in a very different direction, can you believe that Sampha is back? I can't, and that shock definitely does hold a little bit of weight in Lahai taking my number 32 spot, but more importantly, It's just amazing. This thing soars with some of the most spacious and intricate production I've ever heard. The piano lines in particular take the cake on every track here as just the prettiest things ever. What we're here for, though, is Sampha's voice, and as expected, it leaves me just floored every time. Strong contender for the most aesthetically beautiful album of 2023, and there really isn't that much competition. Sampha can take as long as he needs making the next record, because clearly it was good luck this time. My number 31 pick sees Danny Brown, historically one of the most eclectic and expressive rappers in the underground, taking an introspective approach to his new album, Quaranta. Stripped back in many ways, Danny looks back at what his life has been like since he released Triple X more than a decade ago. The traditional nasally Cypress Hill-esque delivery is there, of course, but far more commonly, we get to hear a more reserved, almost human side of the artist. If you've kept up at all with Danny Brown personally through his podcast or elsewhere, you know that he's recently gone through rehab and generally done a lot of reflection on his life and career, and this album sounds like it 100%. Even in its most solemn moments, though, this is still a Danny Brown album, and you can fully anticipate hearing the creative and silly lyricism that makes him who he is. While definitely not dethroning Atrocity Exhibition, this is probably my second favorite effort from him so far, and shows that he's still got a ton of gas left in the tank going forward. 2023 was the year that I got really deep into country music, and one of my favorite voices in the genre dropped my number 30 this year, and that's Jason Isbell with his new record, Weather Vanes. Isbell's masterpieces, of which there are multiple, mostly come from the mid-2010s, but for his first record post-COVID, he decided to take the reins on production for what is one of his most emotionally intimate records to date. The massive Americana sound is there, of course, but I think lyrically this is one of the most devastating things he's ever done, with the opening Death Wish or the soulful Cast Iron Skillet. There's hardly a moment throughout the record that doesn't feel utterly life-affirming in its humanity. Far more brittle and raw than we're used to from him, I can't think of a better album to have taken that direction for, and it results in an easy contender for the best country record of 2023. Up next, at 29, is a record that I am a bit sad to say has grown off me, but only relative to where I used to rank it. The Worm by HMLTD debuted as my favorite album of the year when it dropped, and it stayed that high up for a pretty long time, but as time has gone on, I've started to feel a little less passionate about it. With that said, this stands tall as the best rock opera this side of the Black Parade, and it contains some of the greatest and most outrageous rock performances of the decade so far, but also a real grasp of the emotional potency of its metaphor, and it wields that spectacularly. There's a range of sounds that will either enthrall or annoy just about anyone depending on their mood. There's a ton of theater kid energy here for sure, but at the end of the day, I can't help but adore this thing for everything it's doing and succeeding at. Short but sweet is the best descriptor for my number 28 pick, Tinashe's 20-minute breeze of an album, Baby Angel. There's not a millisecond of fat on this whole thing, to the point where if the production and instrumentation weren't so eclectic and unique, I would be tempted to call it focus grouped, but it just so clearly isn't. Tinashe is one of the most expressive vocalists in alternative R&B right now, and she absolutely floats over these beats, which are at times ambient, at times pulsating, and occasionally hard-hitting, but always propulsive, bringing every moment cleanly to the next without any kind of error or hesitation. All kinds of electronic influences appear here, from trap to garage to UK bass, and all of it blends together so seamlessly that you start to forget that these individual parts are supposed to be separate in nature. At such a short runtime, there's no reason whatsoever to hesitate on giving this one a shot. For 27, I've got yet another experimental black metal record, this time Liturgy's extravagant opus 93696. Following up their shortest record in 2020 with by far their longest, this is a double album of unbelievable scope and scale. It's maximalist in every way you could possibly imagine, and against all odds, they pull it off. The core compositions are these winding, fluid centerpieces to each of the 4 acts, with the band's signature shimmering jagged guitars, orchestral sounding high-pitched riffs, and borderline unfollowable tempos and time signatures that refuse to let you find your footing, except when they suddenly break off into the most inescapable groove of all time. Ravenna's shrieked vocals are just as phenomenal as ever, and while the lyrics are about as far from intelligible as you can get, reading into them and into the concept of the record about the 4 core representations of heaven on each side of the LPs is either incredibly fascinating or insufferable depending who you are. Judging by where I've placed it on my list, I think you'd be safe to assume I fall in the former camp. Rounding out the lower half of the list at 26 is a familiar face from last year, and that's Death's Dynamic Shroud with Midnight Tangerine. In November, the collective saw fit to remaster and reissue 3 of their previously fan club exclusive records for a wider audience, and of those 3, this was by far the one I am the most partial towards. DDS is most commonly known for their vaporwave works in the 2010s, but ever since I've started this channel, and possibly a bit earlier, they've been reaching rather aggressively out in every direction imaginable, releasing mashups, glitch pop, and, as with here, synth pop. It's funny because of everything the boys have put out, this is definitely the most accessible, but they do it so well that I couldn't care less. The production is just as mind-blowing as I've come to expect, though in a notably more subtle way, instead taking my breath away with lush synths and tiny electronic details to back the vocals. DDS have shown themselves to have a flair for the cinematic, and here I think they make good on that in the best way I've heard from them thus far. A heavy contender for their best project in my eyes. So, back in 2021, I jumped on the McKinley-Dixon bandwagon early, and that year's record kept growing on me even beyond where it ranked in my list at the time. At number 25, I'm very happy to rank the follow-up, Beloved Paradise Jazz. I was a little skeptical at first glance, having waited with bated breath for the follow-up to For My Mama. I couldn't help but scoff a little at the halved length on this one. I was wrong to worry, of course, because with Paradise Jazz, Dixon refines his sound down to an infallible science. Seriously, there is not an ounce of fat to trim on this thing, and yet, so much detail and care is given to just about every second of music here. The live instrumentation remains a cornerstone of McKinley-Dixon's sound and what makes him such a unique presence in the underground right now, and it's produced and arranged so much more intricately than last time. Dixon himself is tackling similarly potent themes here as well, and maintains or even exceeds the cleverness that made me fall in love with him those years ago. Features are on point, with a highlight moment from Geis Guevara towards the middle, and a wild children's choir on the beautiful closer. I can't wait to see where we go from here, because at this point, McKinley-Dixon is batting 4 for 4 and shows no signs of stopping. At number 24 is another album you probably haven't heard of, but deserves way more attention, and that's Bulgarian brutal prog group TDK and their latest, Nemesta. This thing is one of the most unhinged, exciting experiences I've found in 2023, firing on all cylinders with amazing rhythms, noisy sludge metal inspired guitars, and the wildest sax performances on a rock album since, I guess, last year's Hellfire. Every twist and turn on here helps to cultivate this harsh and oppressive atmosphere that you're tipped off to right from the album cover, be it the adrenaline rush of the first track, the increasing distortion of the synths on track 2, or the manic screams on basically every track. This thing doesn't let up for even a second. Just when you think it might give you a more atmospheric break, it rips you right out of your comfort zone with something either brutally heavy or unsettling and disturbing. Black metal has been where most of the experimentation in metal has been this year, but if you're looking for something truly avant-garde and undefinable, look no further than this awesome band. I think they're on to really big things. For 23, I've got an artist that prior to this year has been a huge blind spot for me, and that's Mike with his new album Burning Desire. I knew of him and heard one feature from him on Half God by Wiki, but other than that, I had pretty much no clue what to expect. If this is what I can expect, though, I think I'm gonna have a new favorite on my hands because this is just gorgeous. Seriously, I think this guy must have had his beats handed to him direct from God. There's just this unmatched beauty that feels utterly divine in nature. Mike is obviously a very sleepy-sounding rapper. Even before I ever heard him, I knew that. But With the beats he chooses, it literally does not matter. It actually enhances the hazy, clouded atmosphere that this project thrives off of, invariably putting me in an almost religious trance. None of the tracks outstay their welcome, with almost none of them even breaking 2 minutes, which is, I think, the biggest reason all of this works. It's variety. I look forward both to seeing where an artist goes forward from here, and also to see how Mike got to this point by looking back into his catalog. There's definitely a lot of material I'm excited to look at. At 22 is basically the godfather of backpack rap, Aesop Rock, with his 11th album, Integrated Tech Solutions. Aesop Rock is one of those guys where every single thing he does should be corny. His voice, his thesaurus-like vocabulary, the blatant synths he's been using to flourish his beats for the past decade, all of it should come off as goofy, and yet, if you want to talk about consistency in rap, I don't think there's many out there who stack up, with every record at least having defenders and all of them having at least a bop or two. Why does it work? Because Aesop isn't pretending he's someone he's not. He's a smart guy, a little nerdy, and a pretty standout voice with a lot to say, but isn't the toughest or hardest guy in the room. There's no irony to his lines, he just happens to be a funny guy. About this new record, though, I'm pretty much ready to call this his best. That might be a hot take, but I'm pretty confident in it. Aesop's got his tightest songs, his most clever bars, his most varied production, best range of features, and a concept to explore which ties the whole thing together. I admit sometimes I miss that early 2000s production style he had on Labor Days and Float. I'd love to see him go back in that direction someday, but considering the trajectory we've seen, this is as good a record as he's ever put out. At 21 is an artist who, historically, I have not been able to get into, which is why I am so happy to present Eve Toomer with their new record, Praise the Lord Who Chews But Does Not Consume. It's not even that I haven't liked them before. I heard both Heaven to a Tortured Mind and Safe in the Hands of Love, and really enjoyed them, but aside from standout tracks on the former, I didn't feel like I really got why they were so acclaimed. With this new one, though, I get it. The blend of so many different genres and aesthetics finally coalesced in a way that is entirely seamless to me, and it actually made me go back to the older stuff with a new appreciation for their creative mind. Those records have grown on me now, but it's still this new one I keep returning to and finding more to love about. The vibe of this record to me, what it makes me picture, is that this is psychedelic dance music for angels as they grow their wings in some sort of dance ritual to ascend to heaven. It's blissful, physical, and so coolly energetic. The mixing is busy and overwhelming, but it's not overblown. The cacophony isn't quite measured, but more so it feels like there's just an innate logic to how all these disparate points meet in the middle to create the songs here. Eve Toomer as a personality is also just so captivating here, this sexy, genderless icon of divine sensuality guiding us all through life towards eternal euphoria. I couldn't be happier with how this record turned out, and I finally understand why they are such a beloved artist in modern psychedelic music. Speaking of artists I just completely did not get until this year, at 20 is the new Parannoul album, After the Magic. I'll go on record here and say that I really didn't love To See the Next Part of the Dream in 2021. I still don't. If you remember my Albums of the Year video from that year, you might remember that I did rank the collaboration Downfall of the Neon Youth, but even then I said I preferred a lot of the stuff the other artists were doing to Parannoul. It's because of all of that that I am so surprised and so pleased to be placing After the Magic in my top 20, even in a year that is so stacked with so much great competition. This is everything I wanted Parannoul to be from the start. I thought his vocals were great, his grasp of melodies was solid, but couldn't get past how the songs were structured and how brittle and thin the production was. Here, though, he basically fixes all of my previous issues and improves on all of the things I already liked. The songs feel so much more secure and cohesive in their structuring, and, in particular, the choruses on this thing are so much more memorable, where, long after hearing them, I'll still get the melodies stuck in my head. The production, though, is where by far the biggest steps have been taken towards the positive. Every song is so lush and beautiful, and while it retains a lot of the lo-fi elements and limitations of its predecessor, they add character and flourish rather than hinder the experience. The increased production value here also allows for so much more ambition to the climaxes and builds all over this record. The drums sound crisp and punchy, the bass is so much more audible, and the shoegazy guitars actually sound like shoegaze to me. Overall, I have little to nothing to complain about this record, and I'm just so happy to finally see the potential this guy's got that people have been preaching to me for years. Next, at 19, is a band that you should expect to hear a lot more about from me in the near future, and that's Swans' latest album, The Beggar. Leading up to the release of this album, I had just about every emotion under the sun towards the idea of it coming out, be it fear, apathy, excitement, neutrality, confusion. Swans as a band post-trilogy was already somewhat of a hard sell to me even before leaving Meaning, and while I far from hate that record, it was beginning to dawn on me that perhaps this monumental band who had been on the cutting edge for the past 40 years now could maybe have nothing more to say. Nothing was scarier to me than the idea of Swans just going through the motions aimlessly. Then the tracklist was revealed and things got weird. There's a song called Michael Is Done. Is this their final album? And hang on, a 44-minute track? And it's the closer to a trilogy started in the 90s with The Body Lovers, not even a main Swans record? I had no idea what to expect. What I should have expected, though, is an incredibly solid record from Swans. One of their best, I'd even venture to say. This is a strikingly straightforward record for Swans in a lot of ways. The progressions of many of these songs are a direct path from point A to B, and far more of these pieces resemble regular songs than usual. Sure, they're long, and the record itself is the longest they've ever made, but it's actually rather approachable in some ways. What makes this so fantastic to me is the way that it acts as a look back on the band's entire career almost half a decade in. Swans is a band that has consistently pushed forward with no hesitation, never dwelling on what they've already put out. They don't really play older songs live when they tour, and if they ever do it, it never dates back to the 90s, pre-hiatus. Here, though, it feels to me like they're drawing sonic reference from pretty much every era they've had as far back as White Light from the Mouth of Infinity, and in particular, referencing soundtracks and Glowing Man. This is most obvious on Beggar Lover, which plays out as this massive droney compilation awash with different sections of songs made before, twisted together with new material as a bizarre retrospective. Personally, I don't think this is the final Swans album, but if it is, I don't think there's a more appropriate place they could have called it quits. You know who I never expected to make one of these lists in my lifetime? Jerome's Dream. But at number 18 this year, they've done exactly that. In what universe? This band is probably one of the most iconic freak shows of the Scrams scene, having released one of, if not the definitive album in the genre, and then immediately falling into turmoil after a vocal injury because the singer refused to perform with a microphone. They released one strange album with vocoder, and then called it quits when it wasn't working out, only to reunite in 2019 with a comeback album that was just as lifeless, with uncomfortable shouting replacing the piercing shrieks that made this band so iconic to begin with. So imagine my and everyone's shock when, in 2023, the band is back in full force and somehow the screaming is back. This is genuinely one of the most bestial and incredible noise rock albums I have ever heard, taking that Scrams sound that they cut their teeth on and fusing it with more contemporary styles of post-hardcore and loud rock to masterful results. The guitar lines are harsh and the feedback is almost unbearably pitchy at times, as you can kind of anticipate from this genre, but what's more enthralling to me is the melodies they sneak in here that keep it flowing and give that emotional weight back to the music that otherwise could have been ripped away by aggression. And let's talk about the screaming, because I genuinely have no idea how he did it. How do you go from "you will never perform again" to waiting almost 20 years and then still sounding pretty bad, and then suddenly only 3 years later, it's back to normal and arguably even better? I don't understand, but what I do know is that this is some of the most impressive vocal performance of the year, even devoid of the context. This record is gnarly as hell, slim at only 24 minutes, and gives me hope that we could see a resurgence in a band previously assumed to be a lost cause. This won't be popular opinion, and that's fine, but I think this is their best. At 17, it's not often that one of the biggest albums in the whole world makes it on one of my lists this high, and it's literally never happened with like pop country. But with Zach Bryan, I don't feel like I really even had an option. My delving into country music this year has not really extended into pop country. Most of that stuff I still can't really stand. So when I listened to Zach Bryan's self-titled this year, my expectations were not particularly high. Within a couple minutes, though, I was hooked. This is not what pop country is supposed to sound like, at least that's what I thought. Most of what gets huge gets there by mass appeal, non-specific, and lowest common denominator. This is not that. This is specific, personal, and vulnerable in a way that rocked me to my core, and by the end, all I wanted to do was run it back, and so I did, again and again. I still can't get enough of this, and it's pretty much all on the back of how personable Zach Bryan seems to be as a person. His relationship with faith, ego, aging, and so many more day-to-day problems is filtered through a very raw and real red dirt Americana lens and persona I love so much. The other thing that makes this stand out so much to me is how tuned Bryan's ear is to a tasteful arrangement. There's no bombast here, nothing overproduced or overperformed. Everything takes just as much space as it needs to convey what's necessary, and nothing more. There's a dynamism to the performances that does wonders for the humanity of this thing. That extends to the features too, all of which kill it, but especially Casey Musgraves on the Billboard #1 hit I Remember Everything, which, in my eyes, absolutely deserves that spot, and is actually one of the best songs I've heard this year. I love how they work off each other harmonically and lyrically. If you think all pop country sucks, I implore you to give this song, and then this whole record, a shot, because I'm sure it could convince just about anyone. At 16 is possibly my biggest regret of all the many shows I couldn't make time to go to this year, and that's Big Brave with their new album Nature Morte. I was hoping to see them open for Liturgy in Montreal, Big Brave's hometown, and while I've got tickets to see Liturgy next year instead, Big Brave is sadly not on the bill. Which is super sad because this is some of the most gut-churningly heavy drone metal I have ever heard. The drums carry so much weight behind every hit, filling the mix with these throbbing rhythms and sweeping crashes that the guitar feedback then proceeds to swallow. There's also a post-metal bent to the way these tracks are constructed, where the majority of the time is still spent droning around in the variety of feedback and effects on display, but that drone is propelled towards an eventual massive climax by those same massive drums. I cannot emphasize enough how enormous this thing sounds. The mix is just immaculate. So much of the time listening to this, it feels like I'm physically drowning in guitars. What makes this band so special to me, though, is the vocals. Robin really gives it 110% consistently from front to back here, be it singing, wailing, which is what she does most of the time, or the occasional outright shriek which grabs you by the throat and demands your complete submission to the music. The band's physical proximity to me makes me hopeful that I will get to see them soon, but I still wish I could have seen them on this tour, because I think this is unquestionably their masterpiece thus far. For 15, remember earlier I mentioned the hyper rock trend? Well, with 100 gecs' new album 10,000 gecs, I think we've got the biggest example of all. It's been seemingly an endless wait since the debut album in 2019, and as time went on, I got less and less hopeful that it would live up to my anticipation. But now that we're here, I am very glad to say that despite some initial hesitation, I've come to love this one just as much. What the duo have clearly realized here is they could never reasonably expect to have the same initial sonic impact that they did with 1000 gecs. The shock factor would be gone, especially with how watered down the hyperpop scene got in the wake of the pandemic. Instead, Laura and Dylan come together and put all of their songwriting chops on display with songs that, relative to their old material, are very straightforward, verging on straight alt-rock at time, but are no less energetic, catchy, or exciting than their past works. Pretty much every song is an undeniable jam, from that first sicko mode beat drop on track 1 all the way to the defiant return to the roots closer. In between, they touch down on just as many different sounds as last time around, but with a different sonic palette and a lot more refined tastes for how to flesh out those songs. Billy Knows Jamie is the best nu metal song in a decade, I Got My Tooth Removed is pure ska joy, and Doritos and Fritos is basically the second coming of Primus. It's Hollywood Baby, though, that really blows me away on this record, and kind of ties it all together, which is interesting because it's also easily the most straightforward rock tune, but something about how perfect of a power pop song it is just makes the whole rest of the album make sense. 100gecs didn't top their last album because they didn't need to. Instead, they did just about the last thing you could expect from them, and made a straightforward, very good pop rock album, and honestly, I love it so much more for it. For number 14, I've once again got my album that scratches my Dillinger escape plan itch for the year, and that's Soulkeeper with their debut record, Holy Design. Last year, Callous Dowboys reminded me of the best of later years Dillinger, but this year I got my personal preference when it comes to mathcore, and that's Calculating Infinity's insanity and viscerality. That record is a contender for the most important album to my musical development, and Soulkeeper revived that same feeling I felt when I was 14 of, I don't know how something like this exists, but I need to find out. That's largely due to the fact that this band is part of a more modern trend of using electronic elements to supplement the regular grindcore trio of guitar, bass, and unhinged drummer. Unlike something like, say, Frontierer, though, I find Soulkeeper to be using that electronic element in far more tasteful and creative ways that don't bloat the mix or become overbearing, except when they are very obviously supposed to be. The drumming really takes the cake here, laying down some of the most insane and complicated rhythms like a machine from front to back, managing to stand out for his technicality in a genre all about its technical rhythms, which is a feat in and of itself. The vocals are also very reminiscent of that old school Calculating Infinity and Every Time I Die style of screams that I love pretty much any time I hear them. I'm always pleasantly surprised by the bass tone on this too. The mix is very full for a genre that's usually so treble heavy, and of course, the guitar is as unhinged and effects laden as expected, but never in a way that masks the technical prowess of what's being done. As a whole package, and especially as a debut, I could not have asked for better, and I will be waiting with bated breath for whatever these guys do next. For number 13 is one that I think most people who know me would expect, even though I'd never actually heard this band before this year, and that's Home Is Where with The Wailer. I say that because this thing clicks just about every box I have for music. Passionate vocals, folk punk and Midwest emo aesthetics, unforgettable hooks, and body horror adjacent lyrics about trans identity. The last one in particular is the thing that sucked me into this record and to this day has not let me go. In a term I coined on the Modulation podcast I co-host, this joins the likes of Jordan Mason's Divorce Lawyers as a meat album. You can see it right on the album cover with this grotesque but beautiful sketch of a whale carcass split open and repurposed. The content of this album reflects this image perfectly with fleshy, uncomfortable lyrics throughout, all of which build the narrative metaphor of the titular whaler. Musically, Home Is Where wears their influences on their sleeves, but the range is so wide that there's no chance for them to come off derivative. The biggest influence I pinpointed, I mentioned earlier, that being the lyrical themes and vocal characteristics of Jordan Mason, but in terms of the emo side, it's pretty obvious that The Hotelier is a massive point of inspiration in terms of instrumentation and songwriting choices made throughout, and also the way the whole album is structured feels very reminiscent of Home Like No Place Is There. It can't be ignored either how much of an influence some of the anti-folk and folk punk artists of the past couple decades have influenced this, especially an act like AJJ. With these three core influences, I've already named three of my favorite records of all time, so it's no wonder this is on my list. But what makes this rank so high is just how personal they make it. Everything is so lovingly crafted and arranged where every note and word feels carefully selected and molded into a piece of a greater whole, and the result is one of the greatest, most unique punk albums I've heard this decade, and one I'll be returning to for a while to come. At number 12, I've got an album that took me completely by surprise, and that's the Sofia Cortes's debut, Madres. House is a genre that I appreciate, but don't necessarily have the experience or vocabulary to properly quantify, most of my experience being French house, as with probably a majority of people. When this record came across my desk, I didn't know what to expect, but the last thing I could have anticipated was a contender for not only my favorite house album, but one of my favorite electronic albums I have ever heard. I feel as though electronic music is very intentionally disconnected from any kind of personality behind it. Most electronic musicians either remain anonymous or, at the very least, do not make themselves the center of attention in lieu of their work. When I listen to a house album, or a techno album, or an IDM album, most of the time I'm excited and captured by the technicals or the sonic texture of things, and while that is certainly one of the things that I'm blown away with on Madres, what had me in a chokehold was just how emotional this thing makes me. In a turn of events that I feel is rare for me with this genre, after listening to this record, I feel like I actually know more about who Sophia is as a person, about what she values and her outlook on life. I may be completely wrong in those assessments, of course, but what matters is that this record made me feel a deep, unwaveringly human connection with another person I've never met, and at the end of the day, that's what music is all about for me. I did a little research after the fact about the context behind this record, and unsurprisingly to me, there is actually an incredibly human story behind it, one of desperation, of fear of losing someone, of deep, unselfish gratitude, and of so many other things that make all of the music here even more incredible. This is a record everyone should at least give a shot. It means a lot to me. Next, it wouldn't be a Boundo list without at least one album that's too long for its own good, and at number 11, that album is the new World's End Girlfriend, Resistance and the Blessing. World's End Girlfriend is an artist I've had some passing familiarity with in the past, but it was so brief and long ago that going into this record, I had no idea what to expect. Then I saw that it was 2.5 hours. Yeah, this thing is an epic spanning 3 CDs, a dozen genres, and so many samples it would make Madlib sweat. So, what is it? I'm still kind of struggling to quantify it, but I think if I had to give it a label, it would be that this goes beyond modern classical into the realm of future classical. So much of the aesthetic and instrumental palette is indebted to all different kinds of Western classical music, and yet at its core, this is still 100% an electronic album through and through, be it glitch, breakcore, noise, IDM, plunderphonics, all kinds of sounds, all filtered through this lens of classical, and mixed with guitars and pianos to make something almost akin to post-rock, but so abstracted that it's just experimental. That's all I can call it. So, what about that runtime? To make it this high on my list, it must be a good front-to-back experience, right? Well, yes and no. This thing is absolutely exhausting. It's mentally taxing to go through with this much music, this emotionally invested in one sitting, so I haven't even attempted to, and I've enjoyed it so much more because of that. This thing is split up into 3 CDs, even on streaming, and so I treat it that way, as a genuine triple album. I always put on at least one album in between the discs when I listen, and it makes me so much more excited to return to it when I don't have to worry about setting aside 2.5 straight hours to invest in this. It also helps that every single disc is structured as though it were an act of a film, with highs and lows carrying each roller coaster to its conclusion, but leaving just enough tether at the end to tie into the next act. Each disc is also just as consistent as the others, which is absolutely key here. Tracks like Himitsu and Ave Maria don't appear until the final stretch of the record, and they're contenders for my favorite tracks of the year, period. Overall, I don't know if I could properly justify to you why such a long and overbearing record makes it so high for me, but I also feel like I don't have to. All I can say is that this thing blew my mind from front to back, and every listen feels like a fresh experience. Now, ushering in my top 10 and going under her own given name for the first time is Reverend Kristen Michael Hayter, formerly Lingua Ignota, with Saved. Kristen has maintained what I would consider to be the absolute most consistent discography of any working artist right now. Ever since she debuted in 2017, every single thing she's put out has been distinct, and every single thing has been a masterpiece. With Saved, she is at her most distinct ever, which is what I had hoped would happen when she moved to a new alias. This time, some of that old neoclassical darkwave sound still shows up at points, but more than anything, this is a dive right into Appalachian folk music and cultish gospel music. The concept is pretty clear here, intended to act as though it were a compilation of lost tapes from some backwoods Christian cult in the 50s. Some of the tracks could only have about a minute salvaged, the rest being completely lost to damage and time. Other tracks play through in their entirety, but have very obvious flaws, either massive distortion or completely skipping or losing volume. It's an incredibly compelling concept, and one that, were it anyone else, would be very easy to fall squarely into the realm of camp. But because this is Kristen, she gives it 110% at all times, and she sells it both in her loudest moments and also in the way she maintains a degree of restraint throughout. This restraint is what allows for the most horrifying and emotionally taxing moments to have the impact they do, and also for her performances of traditional hymns and standards to come off as entirely sincere. Kristen continues her legacy as my favorite solo artist in experimental music, and while I was initially hesitant to hear what she'd do after abandoning lingua ignota, I've been wholeheartedly proven wrong and cannot wait to hear what she follows this up with. Long live Reverend Kristen Michael Hayter. For number 9, I've got a record that affected me just as much emotionally, though in a completely different way. Spanish Love Songs is a band I discovered for the first time this year before they released No Joy, and it immediately became one of my most anticipated records of the year. The way the band played, the lyrics they wrote, and the way that Dylan sang them, it all felt like it was made for me. I then found out that this album was not gonna be punk. Instead, it was gonna be kinda Bruce Springsteen-y Heartland rock with heavier synths, bigger guitars, and more straightforward hooks. I wasn't quite disappointed, but hearing all of that out of context when, at the time, what I thought of from the band was the intensity of schmaltz and brave faces, I was extremely confused. But then I listened to the record and everything made sense. More than that, I realized that this is absolutely the direction this band was always supposed to go. This is the best thing the band has ever done, and while it's not a complete rejection of the punk and emo they'd been working with before, it's still a clear enough departure that it feels totally unique to them. One thing that has not changed since their previous work is the lyrics, and that's what immediately made me realize that this was gonna work. I don't even know if the lyrics here are better than in the past, but by putting the vocals so front and center and backing them with such powerful and anthemic instrumentation, it becomes impossible to ignore, and being forced to pay attention to Spanish Love Songs lyrics is pretty much a one-way ticket to tears. The scope here is much smaller than that of their previous records, intimate and interpersonal, and yet the stakes feel just as high, if not higher. Haunted holds such a played-out sentiment of, don't give up even though it sucks, but there's such a specificity to how the subject of the song is painted that I can't help but get wrapped up in the minutia of it, of the body in the McDonald's parking lot, of the suburban hell that drives people to kill themselves to feel alive. Pair that with a chorus that's just unforgettable, and you have the best rock song of 2023, and that recipe is what makes every song here equally fantastic. I can't get enough of this record, and I hope more of you listen to it. Next, at number 8, context is always a hard thing to talk about with art, and with Sufjan Stevens' latest album, Javelin, that's never felt like more of the case. The poor guy just cannot seem to catch a break for even a second as of late, and with news of so many tragedies happening around him right when this record came out, it was pretty much impossible not to have all of our first listens colored by the news. I'm gonna go out on a limb here, though, and not all of you have to follow me, but it's what I genuinely believe. Even devoid of any of the context leading up to the release of Javelin, this is Sufjan's best album. Now, maybe that comes with some caveats, like the fact that there's a good chunk of his more acclaimed work that I haven't even heard or don't remember particularly well, but I will say definitively that in a choice between this and his other two mega classics, I'm going to pick this every time. Javelin, to me, is the perfect culmination of just about everything that has made Sufjan such a special and exciting artist to follow for the past couple of decades. It's got some of his most emotionally rapturous lyricism, his broadest range of instrumental palettes, and one of the most cohesive concepts yet. To me, this is what I wanted from Carey and Lowell, and while this is far more abstract than that record, there's something so much more haunting about that to me. Sonically, this is also a great blend of his last two records, A Beginner's Mind and The Ascension. On the one hand, a majority of this is super intimate and tuneful folk, but on the other, almost every song has some kind of symphonic or electronic element that fills it out and gives depth and weight to the mix. The number one thing, though, that places it high on my list, and also his whole discography, is the pacing. This is, without a doubt, the smoothest paced album of 2023, and I can't even think of any competition. Not a second of this thing feels purposeless, tedious, or even anything less than fantastic. There's a track near the end of this thing, Shit Talk, phenomenal track of course, that genuinely took me 2 whole weeks of listening to this thing somewhat regularly to realize that it was 9 minutes long. I genuinely thought it was just another song on the record because it goes down so smooth, which is both a testament to that song's pacing and also that of every other song on the album to meet that equal level of quality. I really hope with all of my heart that Sufjan is getting better and doing okay in the wake of all that has happened, but if it is any minuscule amount of consolation I can offer, this is without a question his masterpiece in my eyes. Now is where my ranking gets really interchangeable. Anything past this point could pretty easily be my number one of the year depending on my mood, but I had to pick a ranking no matter how painful. With that out of the way, my number 7 is the latest album by Wednesday, Rat Saw God. This thing coming out in early April was a pretty good signal of how much country-influenced stuff was going to dominate my 2023, because for as many other sounds and genres as this thing blends in there, country and alt-country are truly at the core of this record, giving a focal point for everything else to recall. Amongst those sounds are things like shoegaze, alt-rock, slacker folk, and most of all, noise rock. The opening set of tracks display this angle the best, with Hot Rotten Grass Smell serving as a brief but impactful intro to the shoegaze with siren-like guitar bends and instrumental breaks. It builds nicely to the real opener, Bull Believer, which, across its more than 8-minute runtime, crashes and recedes over and over, and then pulls itself back for one final collision of cacophonous noise rock, one of the best musical climaxes of the year, hands down, with a powerful backing beat at the shrill screams of vocalist Carly Hartzman. Upon initially hearing these opening moments, I was confused as to why this was not left to the end of the record, perhaps as a final hurrah that leaves the album in a pile of dust. As the record went on, though, I came to realize the genius behind putting this much energy right at the front. I can't completely explain why it works, but by putting such a powerful moment right at the front, I feel like it gives the record room to ease into its other strength, possibly the greater strength, that being the more straightforward country and indie stuff. We've heard Carly shriek, now we get to hear where I think she really glows, her regular singing. I've seen quite a few people critique the vocals on this thing as dull or disinterested, and it's one of the few times I've ever heard a critique of an album I like and genuinely not been able to see where they're coming from. These are some of the most emotive vocals on a record this year, perfectly suited to the sarcastic, bitterly funny lyrics laid across this thing. Sure, there's a level of monotony in the literal sense, but considering the communities and locales being described on here, is there anything else you would want? That tangent aside, I want to shout out my favorite track here, even better in my opinion than Bull Believer, and that's Chosen to Deserve. There's something so simple about the appeal here, and yet it's executed with such tact that I can't help but fall further in love with it each listen. The way that very rudimentary guitar lick in the intro riff leads into the chords, the melody of the chorus, and the way that the verses' lyrics flow at jarring paces, and the matter-of-factness with which they describe these really commonplace but no less horrible traumas, every element works in this track's favor and culminates as one of my favorite pieces of music of 2023, on one of my favorite albums of 2023. The rest of the album holds up to exactly this same quality, if for different reasons, and if you didn't give this one a shot yet, either because of the detractors or just because you didn't know about it, I implore you to try it out. I hope you thank me later for it. Up next at number 6, I've got the new debut album from model actress Dog's Body. Industrial as a genre has always been an inherently gay subculture in music, from the innovators like Genesis Peorage or the not-so-subtle homoeroticism of Trent Reznor's Nine Inch Nails, even just in terms of the sound of industrial, the rhythmic pulsating and mechanics of the machinery can't help but bring to mind the visuals of pistons and thrusting metal grinding against metal. There's an inherent traditional dark masculinity to it, but also a vast subversion of that masculinity that comes in form of intimate and raw expression of emotion. Dog's Body is about as gay and masculine as an album can get, with muscular rhythms, aggressive bubbling sexual tension that just refuses to boil over, and a kind of craving desperation for touch that, when I describe it in words, may not sound inherently queer, but anyone who has experienced firsthand will immediately recognize it. It brings to mind one of the most obvious sonic influences of this record, that being Shoo Shoo and Jamie Stewart's restrained, yelpy tendencies, but also the type of longing that comes with any given early Shoo Shoo song. Much of the lyricism is hard to really discuss tastefully as an outsider because, for as much as it's obscured by some slight metaphor, it really is all about the mechanics and logistics and physicality of gay, man-on-man sexual intercourse, and all that that entails both physically and emotionally. Queer as I may be, a gay man I am not, and so I'm left to my own devices to try and interpret and imagine the experiences on blatant display. Less exclusive to gay coupling, however, is the string of toxicity implied to take place in each of this record's encounters. There's a disconcerting devotion or compulsion towards these really dangerous power imbalances that always seem to leave the narrator giving away way more than they could ever take and receiving apathy at best in return. This debasement is the hook that will likely grab most listeners, and also the compelling starting point for the incredible arc this record takes, both musically and emotionally, on its path to the penultimate sleepless and grand emotional finale of Sun In. The revelatory nature of this musical arc is what truly cemented this as a contender for my album of the year, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but if you've heard this record, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Musically, it definitely wears its influences on its sleeve. I've been colloquially calling it LCD Shoe System as a joke because those are by far the most obvious influences on this thing, but it evades criticism of being derisive by expanding on those two core influences in so many interesting ways and playing those beats as hard and as excitingly as possible. The way this record uses noise and angular guitar noise mixed with the kind of dance punk sound they're adapting is, while clearly inspired, also extremely original in its product, and that combined with the ways this record has affected me emotionally throughout this year leads this to be one of my top albums on this list and will likely make it pretty high when I inevitably do a best of the decade list years from now. Next, for my number 5 pick, we have a returning contender from 2022, and that's Blut aus Nord with the second part of their ongoing Disharmonium series, Nahab. Last year, I was completely floored by the sheer originality of Undreamable Abysses and its brand of, as I described it, bloodborne metal. This time around, the band has chosen to double down on that horrifying psychedelic sound and explore it so much further, and the result is an album that I find to be simultaneously more refined and tight, as well as more creative and experimental at every turn. Everything I loved about last year's record is back in full force, and the siren song of incomprehensible instrumentation is still on full display, spiraling around the listener like a whirlwind of fog and literal insanity. This sounds like the music that plays inside the heads of those guys in the first area of Yarnum who yell, "Away, away!" and stab you with pitchforks. The instrumentation is pretty much impossible to accurately identify, so completely consumed by reverb and a billion other effects and production techniques, to the point where it just sounds even more like a blizzard than most atmospheric black metal already does. Beyond comparisons to the previous record, though, there's a lot of things that help it to stand out as a very clear evolution of the formula rather than a reiteration. One of the most obvious ones to me is the prominent use of clean vocals, as much as, or possibly even more than harsh ones. There's this very humanistic quality to the voices throughout this album, while still maintaining the cacophony that makes these records sound like just about anything in the mix could be a voice. The other thing that makes this record sound stand out to me is just how windingly technical it is. Moments here remind me of Oranzi Pazuzu or even Gorgut's Obscura in terms of sheer how the hell did they make that noise factor. Neither of these comparisons could ever be anything short of the highest recommendation possible. The sharp and pointed guitar melodies from last time are still incredibly present, but here they're even more dissonant and unwieldy than before, when you can pick out the fact that it is a guitar, that is. Track for track, I really don't think I have a single complaint about the structure or songwriting of this thing. Where the last record did a great job of innovating and cultivating a brand new vibe and aesthetic for black metal, this record takes that groundwork and builds some of the most memorable moments in all of metal this year on top of it. Moments like the strange and unnerving vocals on The Black Vortex, the technicality of Queen of the Dead Dimension's Closer, or the way that the second to last track seemingly devolves bit by bit into the album's end. There's really not a single moment on this record that doesn't bring me immense catharsis and joy. Last year, I proclaimed an older Bluthaus Nord record, The Work Which Transforms God, as my favorite black metal of all time, but this year's Nahab, I think may have somehow surpassed it. At number 4 is a collaboration between two of hip-hop's most esoteric and exciting MCs over top of some of the most insane production on a record this year, with both members coming together at the absolute pinnacle of their artistic development up to this point. That album is We Buy Diabetic Test Strips by Arm & Hammer. What, you were expecting me to say a different album? Well, maybe you should check out my Patreon for a whole second video about albums that didn't quite make the list. Anyways, Arm & Hammer. It wouldn't be a Boundo list if there wasn't at least one Billy Woods adjacent record ranking high, and We Buy Diabetic Test Strips sees him and Elucid coming together once again to release what is unquestionably my favorite Arm & Hammer release. It's been a few months since this album came out, and I've been listening to it at least once or twice a week since then, and yet I still don't know how to articulate just how impressive and vast of a project this is, whether it be the dense, multifaceted, and complicated lyrics and themes coming from both members, the massive variety of production styles and guest producers, or the unmistakable performances from everyone involved. There's not a single element that is straightforward to understand, but all of them reward repeated deep listening and analysis. Starting with the production, I first have to shout out the sheer list of talents behind the production of these tracks, whether it be big names like LP, JPEG Mafia, or frequent Billy Woods collaborator Kenny Segal, or smaller but no less phenomenal beatmakers like DJ Haram, Child Actor, or Messiah Music. Every beat is insane, diverse, and unlike anything I've ever heard. The 4 Peggy-produced tracks deserve special attention because, in an era of his career where he seems to be obsessed with maximalism in his tracks, it's awesome to hear him move in the direction of subtlety and atmosphere that made some of his older material so influential. It makes me wonder if his recent remake of the Ghost Pop tape had any influence on how he chose to make beats like Woke Up and Ask Siri How I'm Gonna Die and The Closer. I also have to shout out LP's contribution on The Gods Must Be Crazy, which has me desperate for another Run the Jewels record, or even better, a solo LP record, because I forgot how intoxicatingly fantastic he is at making beats. Much like Run the Jewels here too, is the chemistry between Billy Woods and Elucid, bouncing off each other much like Killer Mike and LP would, but somehow even better. And that chemistry is the last missing link that brings this together as the best Arm & Hammer record. In the past, I think there's been something of a slight talent gap in the group, if only for the fact that Billy Woods is just the greatest rapper alive. But on this record, I think that talent gap is the smallest it has ever been. And then on top of that, there's a synergy between them that is so palpable that it vastly overshadows any dissonance there might have otherwise been. Whether it be the way their flows and verse structures bounce off each other, or the way they build up a narrative with their two very distinct flavors of storytelling, not a single idea goes over Rocky, and the result would be my favorite rap album of the year, if not for one more album that we'll get to soon enough. Before we do that, though, let's talk about the band Sprain and their sophomore and seemingly final album, The Lamb as Effigy. Sprain is a band I knew about before from their 2020 record as Lost Through Collision, which I loved and then promptly forgot. Even if I had remembered, though, I don't think anything could have adequately prepared me for what this album was going to be, where that album was a pretty straightforward collusion of slowcore with post-hardcore. The Llama's Effigy is a record that I couldn't concisely describe as anything beyond experimental rock if I tried. Across nearly 100 minutes, it feels like the band expands pretty much every form of left field rock and hardcore music out there, from no wave to drone to post rock and on, never lingering on any one thing too long and often combining them in ways I would have never imagined possible until now. What's interesting, though, is you might not know it from the first little bit of the album. The first two tracks play it relatively straightforward as an aggressive fusion of noise rock and post-hardcore, with all the trappings included, like shouty man vocals, angular guitar lines, and irresistible bass grooves abound. By track 3, we've started to see some of their slowcore roots and some straight-out harsh noise added in the mix, but it's not until track 4 that we fully get a grasp of how vast and expansive this record is. At 25 minutes long, Margin for Error is something to behold even if just for that runtime, but what's more fascinating is how it uses that time, basically crafting a long and winding drone piece with organs and guitar reverb with vocals lying over top, almost verging on neoclassical darkwave in the first half, but continuing to grow in volume and complexity as more guitars are added on, as well as pianos, bass, and an endless amount of reverb. The vocal register rises, and for the entire second half of this track, we're treated to something that I could only even loosely compare to some of the longest passages in the Swans trilogy, but even then, it gives off a much different, intangible feeling to it that I can't even begin to articulate. And that's just one track of many past this point, which expands and grows well beyond any kind of scale you could reasonably expect of it. The commercial nude goes from free improvisation to slowcore to harsh noise to full-on classic-style post-rock. The reclining nude returns to some of that drone from before, but gives it simultaneously so much more noise and so much more beauty with a very prominent piano. Every track from here on out, aside from the no-wave rager We Think So Ill of You, is over 10 minutes, and none of that time is wasted, even on the extremely sparse and dynamic closer. The closer especially leads me to my understanding of what makes this record so unique beyond its fusion of genres. I would describe it as, more than anything, akin to an art installation at a gallery. You cannot touch it, you cannot manipulate it, it simply stands, immovable inside an empty white room to be observed and analyzed and interpreted. There's a starkness, almost a sterility to the way this record uses its sounds and influences, and while sterile is often a word that I would use negatively when describing harsh music like this, here it is the most glowing praise because it is used so artfully. I wondered how an album like this could ever translate live, and I think it's pretty clear that even the band couldn't figure it out, and now that they have disbanded, I guess we'll never know. In a way, that's sad, but in another way, I couldn't imagine another outcome here, and I'm just excited to see what they do next independently. For now, I can just be happy with the masterpiece that they left behind. Coming up on the end here, let's talk about my number 2 pick, Soft Scars, the latest album from Yule, who has very quickly climbed the ranks of my favorite artists recording right now with their beautiful use of ambient pop and synth pop production on their previous 2 records. When I found out another record was coming out, I was extremely excited, but as I tend to do, avoided listening to any pre-release singles to get as raw of an experience as possible. In the case of Soft Scars, that proved to be the best possible choice, as it allowed me to be totally shocked by the change of sound that once again falls into the category I mentioned earlier of hyperpop adjacent artists going all in on the guitar. Hyper rock. Now, to be clear, Yule never really made hyperpop. Their sound was certainly drawing from a lot of the same influences, and there was definitely fan crossover, but it was definitely not the same. The embrace of guitar music on this album still comes as a distinct surprise to me, though, considering how deliberately artificial and synthetic the gorgeous soundscapes of Serotonin and Glitch Princess were. But by embracing shoegaze and alt-rock as an aesthetic, Soft Scars manages to act as both a great piece of retrospection on a past era of music, and also an innovative thrust forward for a genre which, for as much as I do love shoegaze, has a pretty bad tendency to stagnate and rest on aesthetics over everything else. For Yule, it provides an opportunity to expand their emotional range in the music outside of the mesmerizing and ethereal. We get to hear angry Yule, heartbroken Yule, angsty Yule, and so many other styles that we've never gotten before. This record appeals to me in such an innate, unshakable way that I'm almost struggling to even explain that appeal in a basic sense, because to me, it feels so obvious. I'm not here to win you over or make you agree that this is the second best album of the year, because that's not the point of this. I'm just going to gush about some things that I love about this record. Daisies, for one, is the best shoegaze song since, well, I guess last year when Always released after the earthquake, but this is a standout for some very different ways than that, in particular the dynamism of the mix and the way that the song is structured with this awesome build that at first places the auto-tuned vocals front and center in the mix and then gradually surrounds them and eventually suffocates them for an absolute rager of a chorus with one of the most iconic guitar lines of the decade so far. Cyber Meat is a nice burst of energy right before the end with these super playful vocals and lyrics underpinned by equal parts guitar and glitchy synth work that drive it along just as much as the irresistible drum beat. Ghosts, in contrast, is this somber ballad which still maintains a driving beat, but the instrumental is mostly awash with a soft but suffocating guitar drone, never overwhelming and instead displaying what most of us already knew by this point, but is always worth rediscovering, and that's that nobody knows how to make a soundscape like Yule. I love this record so much. It's just so life-affirming to listen to, and I hope that some of you will listen to it and have at least a similar experience to the one I had obsessing over this thing since its release. I had to miss seeing Yule perform recently and was pretty sad about it, but even then, having this record here to comfort me made it okay. Normally, this would be where I tell you my number one pick, but I actually realized as I was recording the voiceover for this video that I managed to make a very, very big omission, and that's that I somehow forgot to include one of the absolute most defining moments in music this year, the new Anochni and the Johnsons album, My Back Was a Bridge for You to Cross. This is one of the most important and affecting releases of the decade so far, laying bare the emotional toll that living in this violent and oppressive but also beautiful world can be for trans women like us. Anohni's singing is some of the best I've ever heard, and the instrumentals, particularly a guitar solo towards the middle of the album, are some of the most incredibly performed of the year. Had I remembered this in time, it likely would have ranked right around the 20 range in the list, so I'm pretty embarrassed that I missed it outright. Anyways, back to my main list. Sorry for the interjection. And now, finally, at number 1, remember when I said every list had to have at least one Billy Woods album? Yeah, this one has 2, just like last year. Teaming up with producer Kenny Segal for the second time since their 2019 collaborative masterpiece Hiding Places, Maps sees both artists coming together even more experienced and better prepared than ever before. It really goes to show how diverse of an artist Billy Woods is to have dropped half a dozen albums in the past 5 years, 11 if you include Arm & Hammer releases, and yet every single one is completely distinct aesthetically and thematically, and every single one more than justifies its own existence. Even though Billy Woods' vocal range is relatively limited in comparison to, say, Danny Brown, he more than makes up for it with a wide range of storytelling ideas and production styles to make every record a standout. As his first record reusing a producer that he's already had a whole album with, I was curious if Maps would be his first record to retread any of that kind of thematic or sonic ground. But I was foolish, of course. I love Hiding Places, but of the two, I think I would take this record any day, and that ultimately comes down to the chemistry the two have cultivated together. There's something so beautiful about seeing two artists who have already made their masterpiece coming together years later and outdoing themselves on every front, using all of the experience they built up last time, as well as all that they've learned independently from their separate careers in the meantime. The beats on this thing are just perfect, be it the laid-back, jazzier stuff like Rapper Weed and The Layover, the darker instrumentals like Baby Steps, Babylon by Bus, and Gear Zero, or lush and beautiful beats like FaceTime and Soundcheck. There's even some really out there stuff like Blue Smoke, which reminds me most of the For Free interlude on To Pimp a Butterfly, or some of the more abstract moments on For My Mama by McKinley Dixon. There's so many little flourishes and eccentricities that make even the simplest beats shine bright. Maybe a little piano run, or even a sax solo, a muffled acoustic guitar, or like a stray hi-hat. All these little things that accumulate and show an incredible attention to detail and equal care for every single beat. And then, of course, every beat is so consciously designed to fit around Billy Woods' voice, cadence, and flow to the point where you'd think he just did it himself if it weren't so transcendentally good that it would have to be someone's only job to get them that perfect. And then Billy Woods himself. The theme here is a lot looser than the last Kenny collab, which was pretty explicitly about gentrification. This one instead portrays a series of vignettes, each one independent, but all carrying the ongoing theme of the types of people and experience he meets on tour. Really though, this album has been out since May, and I still haven't completely wrapped my head around everything he's putting down here. I genuinely don't know how he does it. He releases an average of like 2 albums every single year, and every single record, hell, every single song is so intricately laced with double entendres, internal references, and bars that will have you falling down Wikipedia rabbit holes constantly. Every single time I listen to this album, I find new lines that are my favorites, be it Asleep in the Back Like Future, or the Ready to Die It's No Biggie opener on FaceTime. Every line is an awesome one-liner to the point where I get overwhelmed even trying to handpick a couple to shout out. The choruses on this record are also super worth mentioning because it's secretly been one of Billy Woods' greatest strengths this whole time, and I don't think enough people talk about it. It could be the Every Victory Fearic line on Soundcheck, or the infinitely more complex but somehow no less catchy tirade on The Layover. Sam Herring takes the reins for the absolutely gorgeous FaceTime chorus, and that brings me nicely to the features here, of which there are several, and every single one kills it. I saw Shrapnel open for Billy Woods last year, and my very first thought was, man, I hope they do something with him, and lo and behold, they're here, and it's one of the best songs of Woods' whole career. Immediately following that, though, we get Year Zero with its Danny Brown feature, which is borderline comedic in how completely he derails the song, basically a cappella rapping the entire second half of the track with occasional jabs of instrumental, but mostly it's just him going on and on and on, and it's amazing. Elucid makes a few appearances, naturally, and we get a bit of Kelly Chris, and Aesop Rock makes an awesome appearance that matches the quality of everything he did on his own album this year. Really, the bottom line on this record is that it's the best rapper alive right now, getting back together with the best producer he's ever worked with, collaborating with some of the best feature acts you can get right now, and not a single thing goes wrong. Of course, it's my album of the year. This is one of the best albums of all time, and I am in utter disbelief that we're still being blessed with so much amazing music from someone who would still be the GOAT even if he only dropped an album like every 2 years. And that's my list. Disappointed that anything didn't quite make the cut. As I mentioned before, you can check out my Patreon where I'll be recording a whole second unscripted video just talking about some of the albums that didn't make my list, some honorable mentions, and even some of my favorite classic albums I heard for the first time this year. 2023 has been fairly tumultuous and extremely busy for me, and 2024 doesn't look to be any less busy, but starting in February, I'm going to be attempting something I never even thought I'd get close to being able to do. I'm going to be taking a whole month away from work and working full-time on YouTube for that whole month. I don't anticipate being able to ever fully sustain myself on YouTube income alone, but I really, really want to get this to a point where I can comfortably supplement a part-time job so I can make more videos and stop giving random empty promises about more stuff is coming soon. It's especially my Patreon who you'll have to thank for my ability to do that. Every single person in my Discord is so cool, and I'm excited to see who else joins in the near future as I really push myself to make more videos and keep doing this because I love it. The link to that is in my description. Oh, also, a huge shout out to Harry and Evan from Modulation, the podcast I've been co-hosting since May this year. You guys have helped me discover so much music and also helped me to get way better at unscripted music discussion than I ever would have been without it. Thanks to anyone who watched this far, and here's to an even better 2024.